just because Steve and Britt are just jumping in here. And if you would like your turn to come after, you can just say pass for the time being.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on the aspect of comparing PBB to other agencies or on a national level. I appreciate that distinction, so that way we're knowing that we are doing a better job than other folks.
Andrew?
Thank you, Doctor. One question on what you've written here for paragraph 100. You mentioned that when there are calls that meet the ECIT criteria, an ECIT officer responds about 3/4 of the time. But that the lack of response in that quarter is rarely due to an ECIT officer not being available. In fact, it's only 6% of the scenarios where an ECIT officer doesn't respond. What accounts for the other 94% of the circumstances? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, actually, Tom, are you still on the phone? No, he wasn't. Tom knows more about that than I do. I think that they were not dispatched they were not sent out by their supervisor. Tom, do you want, or we may also ask this, I'm not sure, do you want to comment on that? I'll put you on the spot. What happened to this? Oh, it has to do with the ECIT calls that were not dispatched. There's about, what, 25%?
Right.
Where they were not sent out. And there are people here from the police bureau that may be able to respond to. Do you remember what your analysis of that?
The short answer is there is no ECIT.
Hold on one second. Hold on. We have a...
Put it near the mic.
Oh, hold it near the mic, yeah.
Okay, if there was no ECIT officer available, then no ECIT officer would be dispatched. But I think the situations that you're also referring to is when no ECIT officer arrives on scene, which also may be that the incident was resolved prior to an ECIT officer being able to get on scene. Higher priority calls where the sergeant called off the ECIT officer. So it's not that 25% that there's no ECIT officer available. In fact, I think it was only 6% when there was just no ECIT officer available.
I think this is a question, Maxine's here somewhere in the audience. She asked, she covered this in her story.
Yeah, I think there were times when I had asked the same question, and you had said there are times when the call is completed before the ECIT officer gets out. It was called an incomplete call.
Yeah, some of those calls were, yeah, we're not sure exactly all of them. I don't think we have a complete answer to that question, but we can look into that more. Does anyone from the police bureau want to respond? Oh yeah, we've got a deputy chief here. Respond. You have a microphone?
Tracy Reed, Portland City Attorney. The majority of the 94% of the 25%, I don't know the exact numbers right now. I do know that the majority of those calls, an ECIT officer is in fact dispatched by BOEC, but often, remember that all of our officers are CIT trained. Often an ECIT officer will be dispatched, but the CIT trained officer that gets there first is able to handle the call, and the ECIT officer is canceled. That's a high percentage.
That makes sense.
Thank you.
A lot of the regular officers feel they can handle these calls, and so, and they do handle the vast majority of the mental health calls. So ECIT is called in a smaller percent, and they're handling the ones where someone's life is in danger, somebody's threatening somebody. It's the more serious ones for the ECIT. And like I said, there's a lot of mental health calls that aren't, 26,000 a year. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. Lakeisha?
Okay. Marcia?
I appreciate with the implementation of the training that there's role playing. It wasn't clear to me if the entire bureau got that training, if everybody's cycled through that, or if it was just specific units such as behavioral health units. So if you could clarify.
Yeah, sure. So everybody did get that. It was required in-service training for all officers.
And I think to the point of being a national leader and what we do, I think Portland, Multnomah County is a national leader in best practices, but I would extend that we can't, that's not sufficient for compliance, in my opinion, as far as, I think we have the resources to do, we are a model agency here in Portland, so I think it's really important to live up to that standard and continue to do as best as we can through integrated procedural justice. And I wonder, through the employee, I wrote it down somewhere, info system, how are we measuring the use of procedural justice or implicit bias training effectiveness on officers who are not doing gross overt use of force issues in the community? So how are we doing that on a day-to-day before it escalates?
So for the average officer, I mean, there's always potential citizen complaints, right? So they have that availability and they look at that. And the reverse is also receiving commendations, compliments from people. That's kept in their files as well. This system now, they're required to record a lot more information than they used to. But I think that my preferred strategy, and one that I've recommended for years, and I'm very pleased that Portland is starting this, and that is the contact survey. So that community survey that you are all familiar with, there was a component of it where it asked, have you had any contact with a police officer in the last year? And if they did, they ask about these kinds of procedural justice things. Was the officer respectful? Did the officer listen to you? That sort of thing. And, but that's a small group. We have to remember, and when we get into this later about the community-wide survey, 2 out of 3 people in Portland, and in a lot of cities it's 3 out of 4, don't have a contact with the police in the last year or 2. And so they're just listening to media or whatever. But the ones that actually have contact, you want to listen to them. And it turns out that the Portland Police Bureau is just starting working with the National Police Foundation in Washington, D.C., is field testing a new contact survey now, using both I believe text messaging and telephone interviews, but trying to get at, there's your base, for those of you in the audience who aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, it's basically customer satisfaction surveys in the public sector. It's how were you treated by an officer that you had contact with in the last couple of weeks? And that's a database that I happen to sit on the National Council on Measures for Justice, developing new metrics for criminal justice nationwide, and we're pushing for things like this. We need new metrics. We can't just rely on the existing things. So Portland is hopefully on the cutting edge there. So I would keep track of that data when it comes in.
Well, I think I'm aware of the survey that's being distributed, but I think there's been negative feedback, especially with communities of color, where officers have gone and distributed or attempted to have folks fill out the survey, and really the officers are not representative of the community that they're. So there are practical barriers and some things that I think the community should be working towards, or this pccep can be working towards to help facilitate the delivery of the survey.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I think the survey you're talking about is a different survey. That's something that PPB is probably doing as part of its community engagement work. This survey is being done independent, out by an outside third party. And it would just involve text messages or telephone calls. It wouldn't involve any physical surveys.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to just speak to pccep's role in all of this, with the compliance office, with the city, and with the community as a whole. Kind of responding to the end of your comments about just what is pccep's role in this, and looking at the settlement agreement, but also going beyond that. And I think that pccep can do both at the same time. Whenever this when this settlement agreement comes by us and we're looking at these reports, we have a duty to represent the community, which is not always here, but we interact with as pccep members in officially in this capacity, but also in our other roles. Most of us are working in environments where we're coming in contact with the city and its community members. And I think it's essential when something like this is presented to us that we, as you had mentioned, hold people's feet to the fire. And I think that there, in my opinion, is a large concern about there being substantial compliance in regards to everything. And what I want to point out is the difference between outcomes and outputs. And the settlement agreement addresses a lot of outputs, a lot of things that they want to see, the trainings, the mental health units, the teams and those things. But those aren't the end goals. Those are just what we want to get to in order to get to some outcomes, as you were mentioning, around procedural justice, people being treated fairly, people not being killed, folks with mental illness being properly serviced. And until we know what those outcomes are that we want, how are we able, as Marcia and others have pointed out, able to really even assess whether these things are being done? There's a training that the PPB has done, but is that actually leading to officers using less force or helping community members, or feeling that they're feeling better treated? And the community members that I've talked to, that's not the case. With youth communities, with communities of color, that's not what I've been hearing. This executive summary mentions if any violations of the agreement are minor or occasional and are not systemic. We have the death of Andre Gladden and Lane Martin today, or this year, 2 of the 5 people killed by police this year. That's 40%, and both of them were having mental health crises at the times of their death. So how, in a year where 40% of the people killed by police are having mental health crises, can we still be achieving substantial compliance for a settlement agreement that specifically deals with mental illness? And so the question is, are Andre Gladden and Lane Martin, are those just outliers and just outside of what otherwise is good conduct, or are they part of systemic problems that still need to be addressed? I 100% agree that PPB has made tremendous strides in the 5 years that you guys have been working with them, but there's still a lot of progress to be made. It says the settlement agreement was designed to reassure the public and the court that changes made in Portland will be sustained. Changes have been made. I don't know much of the public that feels reassured at this point, and so I believe that, and we'll get into this later, but that substantial compliance is still a ways off.
Okay, can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Okay, you made a lot of good points there, outcomes versus outputs. And I understand your frustration. There have been important incidents. I think, but I'm encouraging all of you to read the settlement agreement carefully and read our reports carefully and DOJ's reports. We are constrained by the settlement agreement. We are. You're not necessarily. But as far as we are focusing largely on changes in their process, changes in their program, changes in their behavior, changes in their training, changes in their audits. There isn't a lot of talk of outcomes. There's talk vaguely about trust. And they weren't held to certain outcomes. Although we have used outcomes periodically. We pushed for a community survey, which they've done every other couple of years, and these contact surveys now. And, and so I think that's one important, the changes themselves, the systems are in place to make change. And I do want to make another comment, which is that these changes don't happen, they don't change a whole culture and a whole organization overnight. These things take years and decades, but they have to be sustained, and someone has to keep an eye on them. And regarding these you talked about, we don't know what the outcomes are, but there's been these horrible incidents, and they're traumatic incidents, and they're catastrophic for families and the community. And I'm not going to comment on some of those because they're still under investigation, but I want to put my academic hat on here for just a second. Okay, so You know, I spent 30 years training PhD students in how to evaluate social programs. How would you know if a program's working or not? And we don't, first of all, you need good research measures, but more importantly, you don't rely on, incidents are what we call error variance. I mean, there's tragic lives, but in a statistician's mind, it's error variance. It's random fluctuation. The reality is, you have to look for patterns. You have to look for patterns overall. That's why DOJ calls them pattern and practice of excessive force. We can debate sometimes whether it's really a pattern or not, but that's what I'd encourage you to look for. There are going to be these things. That also means on that normal distribution, there's going to be a few cops that still don't get it after all this training. And what are we doing about that? You know.